The thing about dying in space is that it's supposed to be quiet, peaceful, even. That's what the vids always showed. Some noble soul drifting off into the star field while orchestral music swelled in the background. Nobody mentioned the alarms. God, the alarms. They screamed through every corridor of the DSV, Kepler like a mechanical banshee having a particularly bad day. And Eli Voss was pretty sure his eardrums were staging a formal protest. "Move! Move! Move!" someone shouted behind him, and Eli stumbled forward in the crush of bodies, his shoulder slamming into the bulkhead hard enough to leave a bruise he'd probably never live long enough to appreciate. Around him, 300 passengers and crew were doing their best impression of a herd of very polite cattle who'd suddenly remembered they had somewhere important to be. The ship lurched. Somewhere far below, something exploded with a sound like God crumpling paper. "This is your captain speaking." The intercom crackled, remarkably calm for someone whose ship was currently being converted into expensive shrapnel. "All personnel to designated escape pods. This is not a drill. Please proceed in an orderly..." The transmission cut off. The lights flickered. Orderly, Eli thought, glancing at the man next to him, who was openly weeping into his sleeve. Right, very orderly. Podbase 7 appeared ahead like the Promised Land, except the Promised Land was apparently overbooked. The crowd bottlenecked at the entrance, a writhing mass of panic and pressed polyester. Eli caught a glimpse of the pod through the chaos. Sleek, silver, already packed with people, strapped into crash seats like sardines with excellent safety protocols. The door was still open. Barely. 37 over capacity. The ship's AI announced in that maddeningly pleasant voice that suggested it had never considered the social implications of delivering bad news. Recalculating survival parameters. Please remain calm. Remain calm? Eli would have laughed if he'd had the breath for it. Someone did laugh, actually. A high, hysterical sound that cut off into a sob. A woman with 2 children clutched to her chest was screaming at a man in a maintenance uniform, something about promises and lies and how dare he. The man looked ready to either faint or throw a punch, possibly both. That's when Eli saw her. She was pressed against the far bulkhead, like she was trying to merge with the metal itself, one hand clutching a data chip so tightly her knuckles had gone bloodless. Almost human, he thought. But his brain kept snagging on the details that were not quite right. The way her eyes caught the emergency lighting and threw it back like mirrors. The slight wrongness in how she moved, as if gravity was a suggestion she was only politely entertaining. Her face was a mask of pure terror, and for just a second, their eyes met across the chaos. Eli was already in the pod, already strapped in, already safe, statistically speaking. Assuming safe meant anything when your ship was turning into an impromptu fireworks display. The harness dug into his shoulders. The door was closing with a hydraulic hiss that sounded too much like a countdown. He looked at the alien woman. He looked at the mother with her children. He looked at the pod door. Closing, almost closed. Then Eli Voss unbuckled his harness, stood up, and stepped out. Nobody noticed. The door sealed behind him with a decisive thunk. Through the porthole, he caught a glimpse of confused faces, someone's mouth forming a question. Then the pod launched, a brief flare of engine light, and it was gone. Eli stood in the suddenly emptier corridor, the alarm still screaming, and thought, well, that was probably stupid. The Kepler's hull groaned like a dying whale. Somewhere, someone was still crying. Eli turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the gathering silence, and wondered if anyone would remember to water his cactus back in his quarters. It was the only thing he'd managed to keep alive for more than 6 months, and it seemed a shame to break the streak now. 8 years had a way of turning heroic sacrifice into paperwork, and Eli Voss had filed himself away in the most forgettable corner of mapped space he could find. Outpost Archer wasn't much to look at, a refueling station that orbited a gas giant nobody had bothered naming, serving ships that nobody particularly wanted to meet. The coffee tasted like someone had strained it through old socks. The gravity plating had an irritating habit of cutting out in the shower, and Eli's co-worker, Jess, insisted on narrating her entire shift like she was hosting a nature documentary about fuel couplings. And here we observe the elusive maintenance tech in his natural habitat, Jess said, peering over his shoulder as Eli recalibrated a pressure valve. Note the intense concentration, the furrowed brow, the complete lack of social skills. I have social skills, Eli muttered, not looking up. I'm just choosy about when I use them. Yeah, and I'm choosy about when I breathe, but I still manage it daily. Jess leaned against the bulkhead, arms crossed. You know what your problem is, Voss? You're like a haunted house, but boring. All atmosphere, no ghosts. Eli made a non-committal sound that could have meant anything from agreement to please go away. The valve clicked into place with a satisfying hiss. He'd gotten good at this over the years, the art of being present without actually being there, of occupying space without leaving an impression. It was almost meditative in a depressing sort of way. The comm crackled to life. Maintenance to docking bay 3. We've got a coupling issue on the new arrival. Jess raised an eyebrow. New arrival? We get maybe 2 ships a week out here. What kind of idiot ends up at Archer on purpose? The kind with fuel problems, apparently. Eli grabbed his toolkit and headed for the bay, Jess trailing behind him like a particularly chatty shadow. The ship waiting at Dock 3 was not the usual rust bucket freighter or desperate smuggler transport. It was sleek, expensive, the kind of vessel that suggested its owner had both money and taste, possibly in equal measure. Coalition registry, but with modifications that screamed Syndicate Worlds. Eli's internal warning systems, rusty from disuse, pinged faintly. Fancy, Jess whistled. Think they're lost? Everyone who comes here is lost, Eli said. That's kind of the point. The airlock hissed open, and a figure stepped through. Eli's hands, reaching for the fuel coupling diagnostic, froze in midair. She looked different. 8 years did that to people, or whatever she was. The terror was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like purpose. She wore clothes that probably cost more than Eli's annual salary, and she moved with that same fluid grace that had caught his attention in Pod Bay 7, except now it seemed intentional, controlled. Her eyes found his immediately, those two bright, two knowing eyes, and Eli felt something in his chest that might have been his heart remembering how to panic. "Eli Voss," she said, and it wasn't a question. Jess looked between them, her expression cycling rapidly through confusion, curiosity, and what Eli recognized as her, "I'm about to make this weird face. Do you two—" "We need to talk," the woman said, still looking at Eli, like he was the only person in the bay, in the station, possibly in the entire sector. Eli's mouth had apparently forgotten how to form words. His brain was busy running through every possible explanation for this moment, and coming up empty, except for one persistent thought. "I should have stayed on the Kepler." "The coupling's in port 7, he finally managed, gesturing vaguely. "I can have it fixed in 20 minutes. "I'm not here about the coupling." "Then why—" "You gave me your seat." Her voice was quiet, steady, and it cut through 8 years of carefully constructed amnesia, like a plasma torch through hull plating. "Pod Bay 7, the Kepler. You stepped out, and I lived." Jess made a small choking sound. Eli wished the floor would open up and dump him into the void. At least that would be familiar territory. The station's mess hall served coffee that could strip paint and conversation that could strip souls, which made it the perfect place for reunions nobody asked for. Eli sat across from Lyra Kane. She'd finally offered her name after Jess had literally pushed him toward the mess hall while mouthing "call me later" with entirely too much enthusiasm, and tried to figure out how to apologize for coffee that tasted like industrial solvent. "I'm sorry about the coffee," he said for the third time. "It's really bad. I should have warned you. There's probably a legal disclaimer somewhere." Lyra took another sip, her face unreadable. "I've had worse." "Liar!" Eli wrapped his hands around his own cup, grateful for something to do with them. "Nothing in the known universe is worse than Archer Station coffee. It's probably a war crime in some jurisdictions. I once drank fermented dock water on Epsilon Station during a 70-hour stakeout," Lyra said calmly. "This is comparatively pleasant." Eli blinked. "That's horrifying. Also, why were you drinking dock water?" "Long story." She set down her cup with a deliberate gentleness that made Eli think of expensive things being handled with care. "I spent 8 years looking for you." And there it was, the conversational equivalent of an airlock breach. Eli felt all the oxygen leave the room. That's a long time to look for someone, especially someone boring." "I'm very boring." "Ask Jess. She'll confirm." "You're deflecting. It's one of my core competencies." He tried for a smile, but it felt wrong on his face, like wearing someone else's clothes. "Look, I appreciate the visit, but you really didn't need to—" "I was carrying data," Lyra interrupted, and something in her voice made Eli shut up. "Encrypted research. Proof that the Coalition's military command had orchestrated the Veil Nebula attacks. If that pod had launched without me, the war would have continued for at least 2 more years. Minimum casualty estimates were 70,000 additional deaths. Eli stared at her. Oh. The data I carried ended the war, Eli Voss. Her eyes caught the harsh overhead lighting, throwing it back like mirrors, like warnings. Your sacrifice saved more lives than you can possibly imagine. I'm really more of a cat person, Eli said weakly. Cats are famously bad at heroics. I think you've got the wrong guy. Lyra didn't smile. In my culture, the Tanari, a debt of life isn't transactional. It's not about repayment or reciprocity or evening scores. It's about witnessing. Someone must know what was done. Someone must carry the memory, or the act dissolve into nothing, like it never mattered at all. Maybe it didn't matter, Eli said quietly. I'm nobody. It was just a pod. Someone else would have. No one else did. Her voice was gentle, but immovable, like gravity. You walked away from your own survival and expected nothing in return. For 8 years, I carried the weight of that choice alone, because no one else knew. No one saw. The records listed you as dead in the initial explosion. Your sacrifice existed in a vacuum. Eli looked down at his coffee, watching the surface ripple from some distant vibration in the station's bones. A ship docking, maybe, or just archers slowly falling apart, like everything eventually did. Why does it matter? I mean, really? In the grand scheme of things, one person making one stupid decision. It wasn't stupid. Lyra leaned forward, and Eli could see something fierce in those alien eyes, something that looked almost human. Almost. You chose nothing for yourself. You walked away expecting no witness, no record, no gratitude. That's not nothing, Eli Voss. That's the most profoundly human thing I've ever seen, and I've spent 8 years studying your species. We're not that interesting, Eli said. Mostly we argue about sports and make questionable dietary choices. You're impossible. But there was something in her voice that might have been affection or exasperation, or maybe just exhaustion, from 8 years of searching for a man who didn't want to be found. Eli took a sip of terrible coffee and wondered when his life had gotten so complicated. 17 minutes ago, he'd been fixing fuel couplings. Now, he was apparently a metaphor for human nobility. He really preferred the fuel couplings. They talked through the station's artificial night cycle. When the lights dimmed to simulate circadian rhythms, nobody actually followed, and the corridors echoed with the kind of silence that made you aware of your own breathing. Lyra told him about the war's end, about tribunals and peace treaties signed on stations far from here, about how the conspiracy she'd exposed had fractured the coalition's command structure so thoroughly it took 3 years to rebuild. Eli countered with the saga of Outpost Archer's Great Coffee Machine Rebellion of '83, when the machine achieved something resembling sentience and refused to brew anything but decaf for 6 weeks straight. You're doing it again, Lyra said, but there was no accusation in it, just observation. Doing what? Hiding behind humor, making yourself small. Eli shrugged, tracing patterns in a coffee stain on the table. It's worked pretty well for 8 years. Why fix what isn't broken? Is it not broken? Lyra tilted her head in that unsettling way of hers, like she was seeing past his skin into the machinery underneath. You work on a forgotten station, drink terrible coffee, and call it a life. That sounds fairly broken to me. Ouch! But Eli couldn't quite muster the energy to be offended. She was right. In that annoying way, people were, when they hadn't earned the right to be right, but were anyway. What do you want from me, Lyra? Seriously. You found me. You told me what happened. I can't give you anything else. I don't want anything from you. She reached into her jacket and pulled out something small, crystalline, roughly the size and shape of a human heart, if human hearts were made of light and geometry. I want to give you something. The crystal caught the dim lighting and fractured it into colors that didn't have names in any human language. Eli had seen Tanari memory stones before, usually in museums or behind very expensive security systems. I can't say that. Those things are worth. It's not about worth. Lyra set it on the table between them, like she was placing a bet on a game only she understood the rules to. It holds a holographic record, my testimony, my memory of that day, of your face as you stepped back, of what it meant. You don't have to keep it, but someone should remember. Eli stared at the crystal, then at her. You spent 8 years looking for me just to give me a fancy paperweight? I spent 8 years making sure your choice wasn't forgotten. Lyra stood, and there was something final in the movement, like a door closing or a chapter ending. What you do with that is your decision. Like everything else you've done. She left before dawn. Station time. Eli stood in the docking bay and watched her ship undock with a grace that made Archer's clunky machinery look embarrassed. Jess found him there an hour later, still holding the crystal up to the dim emergency lighting, watching the fractured colors dance across his palm. So, Jess said carefully, want to talk about your mysterious space girlfriend? She's not my girlfriend. She's a witness. That's either very profound or very weird, and I honestly can't tell which. Jess bumped his shoulder with hers. You okay, haunted house? Eli looked at the crystal, and then at Jess, and something in his chest that had been clenched tight for 8 years finally loosened. Yeah, I think, maybe I am. The crystal ended up on his workbench, wedged between a broken fuel regulator and a coffee mug that proclaimed world's okayest engineer. It caught the light while he worked, throwing rainbow patterns across diagnostic readouts and maintenance logs. Jess asked about it exactly once, and when Eli said it was complicated, she just nodded and handed him a wrench. Outpost Archer kept spinning in its slow orbit. The coffee remained terrible. The gravity still cut out at inopportune moments. But now, when Eli fixed fuel couplings and recalibrated pressure valves, there was a crystal on his bench catching the light, holding a memory of a moment when someone chose nothing, and, in that nothing, changed everything. And sometimes, when Jess wasn't looking, Eli would smile at it, really smile, and think that maybe being remembered wasn't the worst thing in the universe after all.